Oftentimes, what the American public associates Richard Nixon with the most isn't our involvement in de escalation of Vietnam or OPEC or Supreme Court justices or the 1972 election. The most notoriety that his his presidency to this day gets is Watergate and the Watergate scandal. So, in June of 1972, a few months before the November 1972 presidential election, the headquarters of the Democratic National Party, um, headquartered at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., was burglarized. Okay. Um, Eventually, the burglars were tracked down. It turns out one of them had worked in the White House. Um, Perhaps maybe they had been paid slush money from uh, Nixon's reelection committee or something else of the sort. Um, White House staff members, various different things. Um, as these Watergate burglars went on trial, several other things were uncovered. Various other different things were disclosed. And over the course of the next couple years, mounting evidence grew that implicated illegal action by Richard Nixon himself. So, a question and patterns of various different abuses would suggest that there was a cover up. First of all, why would somebody need to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters? Beats me. The 1972 election was going to be a landslide victory for Richard Nixon, and it was. It was unprecedented almost. Why did they even need to do it? Okay. Furthermore, um, Richard Nixon may not have planned it. He may not have sanctioned it, but over the course of the next 2 years, it became increasingly obvious that he knew about it. And one of the ways that it would be proven that he knew about it, concretely at least, was that there were various different audio tapes. You see, the Oval Office was um, the Oval Office had various different recorders that could record various different conversations. And when the topic of which came up in one conversation, the president basically he acknowledges that he knows about it. Not that he ordered it or that he sanctioned it, but he acknowledged that he knew about it. So it's increasingly obvious that there is a cover up and that Richard Nixon knew about it, even though he said he didn't. So, as you would expect, various different prosecutors try to take on the president and begin the process of investigations. And then, of course, you have his political opponents in Congress who begin perhaps an impeachment investigation. Richard Nixon tries to claim executive privilege in withholding these audio tapes from getting into um, Congress and other investigations. And in the United States versus Richard Nixon, the Supreme Court basically says the president needs to hand these audio tapes over. He knows that if these tapes get into the hands of various different investigators, he very well could be exposed as having known about it, even though he says otherwise. So, various different implications begin in the summer of 1974 to begin possibly the process of impeachment. A couple other things were going on around this time. You see, Richard Nixon's vice president was Spiro Agnew. He was former governor of Maryland, who abruptly resigned from his vice presidency because he was accused of accepting bribes as he was governor of Maryland and even as vice president of the United States. So, in exchange for lesser charge like tax evasion or something along the lines, it would be agreed upon that he would step down from his political office. Okay? So now Spiro Agnew would have to be replaced. Richard Nixon picks a popular congressman from Michigan, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford soon becomes Vice President of the United States, and he does so amidst growing and mounting evidence and controversy surrounding Richard Nixon and his Watergate involvement. Okay? So, several different things come into play, and over the course of the next few months, leading on into the summer of 1974, specifically in August, um, Richard Nixon decides that instead of enduring impeachment, which probably would have succeeded, he decides that he is going to resign. So August 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon announces his resignation. He's the first American president to ever do so. He's not the first president to end his presidency early. Other presidents died while in office. They were assassinated or otherwise had health issues. He's the first to resign. He knows. He knows that they've got him. He may not have ordered Watergate. He may not have even approved it. But he lied about knowing about it. And they had proof of that. So, he resigns. And his farewell, he hops onto, I believe it's Marine One, the helicopter that takes the president off. He gives his farewell speech and doing the peace sign and kind of awkwardly like that. I am not a crook. That's a phrase that's commonly associated with Richard Nixon. Um, the American public at this time is very disillusioned. First and foremost, brand new Vice President Gerald Ford is soon inaugurated. He took the oath of office to become President of the United States shortly thereafter. So in 1974, Gerald Ford becomes president. Within a short period of time, you go from congressman to president. That's pretty weird. Otherwise, though, the American people are very disillusioned. You had just come off very bitter involvement in Vietnam and the surrender therein. The bitter divide over peace in Vietnam, the counterculture movement, civil rights, all kinds of untold unrest in the country. And Watergate, and leading into a resignation. The American public develops this distrust of politicians. And a very cynical view really pervades the countryside. And for good reason. You have a president who lied about a burglary, which affected his opponent perhaps. And it was needless. He was going to win that election handily. Okay? So the fall of Richard Nixon just kind of confirmed the idea that the American public has a severe disdain and distrust for American politicians. Okay? It's just kind of this untrustworthy character that had been going around, not just in the Nixon years, but their mistrust of LBJ and how he handled Vietnam and other things. And the Pentagon Papers added to that mistrust. Okay, going back to the Eisenhower era and administration, all presidents had basically inflated and perhaps lied about what was going on in Southeast Asia. The Pentagon Papers proved that out. Military commanders were inflating successes. Even though they were largely successful, they weren't as successful as they said they were. Okay? The American public grew very cynical of politics, and our sense of self-esteem, especially in combination with what was going on with the OPEC oil embargo, gas shortage, inflation, just kind of a low point in our nation's history. A sense of devaluation of self-esteem, if you will, in those Watergate years. So that ends chapter 29. Um, Richard Nixon unceremoniously resigns from presidency because he was going to get impeached. He knew about what happened at Watergate and he lied about it. Okay? Otherwise, though, there would have to be some things that re energize the American public. We're going to talk about those things in the next couple chapters.